The creature lay dying in the shadow of the abandoned research station, its silver fur matted with blood and parasitic lesions. Dr. Sarah Chen had seen many things during her 3 years aboard the medical frigate Mercy, but nothing quite like this. The being resembled an oversized house cat, standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, with intelligent amber eyes that tracked her movements despite its obvious pain. "Jesus," muttered Commander Torres, adjusting his environmental suit's filters. What the hell did they do to it? Sarah approached slowly, her medical scanner already painting a grim picture on her tablet's display. The creature's body was riddled with some kind of parasitic organism she'd never encountered before. Microscopic worms had burrowed through its skin, creating angry red welts that wept a phosphorescent blue fluid. Its breathing was labored, and she could see the tremor in its limbs that indicated systemic infection. The research station around them told its own story of abandonment. The Zelthak Collective had evacuated this outpost 6 months ago, leaving behind only scattered equipment and apparently their test subjects. Sarah had read the preliminary reports during their approach. The aliens had been conducting biological warfare research here, developing parasitic weapons that could devastate enemy populations. When their experiments grew too dangerous to control, they'd simply packed up and left. "The bastards just left it here to die," Torres said, his voice tight with anger, along with who knows how many others. Sarah knelt beside the creature, noting how it didn't flinch away from her approach. Instead, those amber eyes seemed to regard her with something approaching hope. She'd worked with enough animals to recognize intelligence when she saw it, and this being possessed far more awareness than any ordinary pet. "Easy there," she whispered, extending her gloved hand toward its massive head. "I'm here to help." The creature's response surprised her. It pressed its forehead against her palm with deliberate intent, and she felt a gentle vibration through her suit's haptic feedback system. The universal translator in her helmet struggled for a moment before producing a weak, static-filled voice. "Please, help. Others." Sarah's breath caught. This wasn't just an animal. This was a sentient being, and it was using its potentially final moments not to beg for its own life, but to plead for others. "Commander," she called out, her voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "We need to do a full sweep of this facility. There might be more survivors." Torres was already mobilizing the search team through his comm system. "Copy that, Doc. What's the medical situation here?" Sarah ran her scanner over the creature again, her mind racing through treatment options. The parasitic infection was unlike anything in her database, but the basic biological functions were similar enough to Earth mammals that she might be able to adapt existing treatments. The bigger problem was time. The creature's vital signs indicated it had perhaps hours left, maybe less. "I need to get it back to the ship immediately," she said, "and I'll need access to the experimental medical bay. This is going to require some creative intervention." As her team prepared the emergency stretcher, Sarah noticed something else. Despite its obvious agony, the creature was trying to move toward a specific section of the facility. She followed its gaze and saw a partially collapsed corridor that led deeper into the research complex. "There are others down there, aren't there?" she asked softly. The creature managed what she could only interpret as a nod, though the gesture sent another wave of tremors through its body. Sarah felt her resolve harden into something approaching fury. The Zelthak Collective wasn't just known for their biological weapons research. They were known for their complete disregard for any life form they deemed inferior. The fact that they'd abandoned sentient beings to die in agony was exactly the kind of callous cruelty that had made them enemies of half the galaxy. "Martinez, take Team 2 and follow that corridor," Torres ordered. "Full hazmat protocols. If there are more survivors down there, I want them found." As they carefully lifted the creature onto the medical stretcher, Sarah found herself making silent promises. She dedicated her life to healing, to proving that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their military might or technological prowess, but their refusal to abandon those in need. The Zelthak might see this being as nothing more than a failed experiment, but Sarah saw a patient who deserved every chance she could give it. The journey back to the Mercy felt endless, though her chronometer told her it took only 20 minutes. Throughout the trip, the creature remained conscious, those amber eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that spoke of desperate hope. Sarah found herself talking to it, explaining what she planned to do, though she wasn't sure how much the damaged translator could convey. "I'm going to figure this out, she promised as they entered the ship's medical bay. Humans don't give up easily, especially when it comes to saving lives. The creature's response came as the faintest whisper through the translator. Trust. You. Those two words carried more weight than any formal medical oath Sarah had ever taken. As her team prepared the isolation unit and began setting up the experimental treatment protocols, she realized that this moment would define not just this creature's future, but possibly the relationship between humanity and whatever species this being represented. The abandoned research station had become a tomb for the Zelthak's victims, but Sarah was determined that it wouldn't remain one. Whatever it took, however long the fight, she would find a way to heal the damage that had been done here. After all, that's what humans did best, even when the rest of the galaxy had given up hope. The isolation chamber hummed with activity as Dr. Sarah Chen worked through her third consecutive day without sleep. The creature, which she'd begun thinking of as Echo due to its habit of repeating her words through the damaged translator, lay surrounded by a web of monitoring equipment and treatment apparatus that would have impressed the medical staff of any major hospital. Vitals are stabilizing, reported Lieutenant Kim, her chief medical assistant. Whatever you did with that modified anti-parasitic cocktail, it's working. Sarah nodded, though her attention remained focused on the microscopic battle playing out on her display screens. The parasites were unlike anything in the Galactic medical database. They seemed to adapt to each treatment she tried, evolving new resistance mechanisms within hours. It was as if they'd been specifically designed to be incurable, which, she realized with growing anger, they probably had been. The Zelthak weren't just testing biological weapons, she murmured, watching as another wave of nanobotic treatments engaged the parasitic organisms. They were testing weapons designed to defeat medical intervention. These things are programmed to evolve. Echo's large head turned toward her voice, those amber eyes now clearer than they'd been since the rescue. The translator crackled weakly as the creature spoke. Zelthak said, "We expendable testing on my people for years." The broken confession hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd suspected, but having it confirmed made her stomach twist with rage. The Zelthak hadn't just abandoned sick animals. They'd abandoned an entire population that they'd been systematically experimenting on. Your people, Sarah repeated softly. How many of you were there? Echo's response came in fragments, the universal translator struggling with concepts that didn't translate easily. Through patience and careful questioning, Sarah began to piece together a horrific picture. Echo's species, the Vithani, had been conquered by the Zelthak decades ago. Rather than simply enslaving them, the Zelthak had decided they made perfect test subjects for biological weapon development. The Vithani were remarkably similar to Earth's felines in their physiological makeup, but with enhanced intelligence and natural empathic abilities. They could sense illness and injury in other beings, making them ideal healers in their pre-conquest society. The Zelthak had perverted this gift, using the Vithani's empathic nature to test how different biological weapons affected not just physical health, but psychological well-being. They made us feel others' pain, Echo whispered, forced to heal, then infected again. Cycle never ended. Sarah's hands trembled as she adjusted another treatment parameter. The evil of it was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. The Zelthak hadn't just been testing weapons. They'd been perfecting psychological torture methods designed to break empathic species. A soft chime indicated that Commander Torres was requesting entry to the isolation chamber. Sarah activated the intercom. "Doc, we found them," Torres said, his voice grim. 47 Vithani in various stages of infection. Most are, well, they're in worse shape than your patient there. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. 47 additional patients, all suffering from parasitic infections that had been specifically designed to be untreatable. Her medical bay could handle maybe a dozen critical cases simultaneously. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Based on the progression we're seeing, the worst cases have maybe 18 hours. The better ones might last a few days." Echo struggled to lift his head, the effort clearly taxing despite the improvements in his condition. "Others dying because help me first." "No," Sarah said firmly, placing her hand on Echo's forehead. "I helped you first because you were the furthest along in the infection. Your recovery is going to show me how to save the others." It wasn't entirely true. Sarah had helped Echo first because he'd been the one pleading for others instead of himself. And something about that selflessness had touched her deeply. But it wasn't a lie either. Each treatment she'd tried, each small victory against the parasites was teaching her more about how to combat them effectively. "I'm going to need the entire medical staff," she told Torres. "And I want authorization to access the experimental nanotech reserves. We're going to have to modify our approach for mass treatment. You've got whatever you need. Doc, just tell me you can save them." Sarah looked at Echo, whose amber eyes reflected a quiet faith that she wasn't sure she deserved. Then she thought about the 47 other Vithani lying in that hellish facility, abandoned by their captors and waiting to die. "I'm going to save every single one of them," she said with a conviction that surprised her. The Zeltec designed these parasites to be incurable, but they made one crucial mistake. "What's that?" Torres asked. "They didn't design them to resist human stubbornness." Over the next several hours, Sarah's medical team worked with mechanical precision to transfer the Vithani survivors to the Mercy. Each case was worse than the last, some of the poor beings so weakened by the parasitic infection that they could barely open their eyes. But as Sarah began treating them with her modified protocols, she noticed something remarkable. The Vithani were using their empathic abilities to help each other endure the treatment process. Those who were recovering would position themselves near the sickest patients, somehow sharing their strength and will to survive. It was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed in her medical career. Echo, now strong enough to move around the medical bay with assistance, became her unofficial liaison with the other Vithani. Through him, Sarah learned that their empathic network had been both their greatest asset and their deepest torment during the Zelthac experiments. They'd felt each other's pain as if it were their own. "But now," Echo said, his translator working much more clearly, "we feel each other's hope." As Sarah watched the Vithani supporting one another through her treatments, she realized she was witnessing something that the Zelthac, for all their scientific advancement, had never understood. The same empathic abilities that had made the Vithani perfect victims were also making them perfect patients. They weren't just fighting for their individual survival. They were fighting as a community, sharing strength and determination across their psychic network. It was, Sarah thought with grim satisfaction, exactly the kind of thing that humanity had always understood. After all, humans had been saving each other against impossible odds since they'd first learned to work together. The Zelthac might have superior technology and ruthless efficiency, but they'd never learned the simple truth that sometimes the best way to save one life was to save them all. The breakthrough came at hour 72, when Dr. Sarah Chen was running on nothing but caffeine and determination. She'd been studying the parasites' adaptation patterns when she noticed something the Zelthac researchers had apparently missed. The organisms weren't just evolving to resist treatment. They were communicating with each other. "Kim, look at this," Sarah called to her assistant, pointing at the microscopic display. "The parasites in patient 14 are adapting to treatments we haven't even used on that patient yet. They're sharing information somehow." Lieutenant Kim leaned over the scanner, her eyes widening as she processed the implications. "They're networked. Like a biological internet." Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine. If the parasites could share resistance patterns instantaneously across all infected hosts, it explained why the Zelthac had considered them the perfect biological weapon. No matter how many individuals you treated successfully, the parasites would adapt faster than any medical response could counter them. But it also gave Sarah an idea that bordered on madness. "What if we used their own network against them?" she murmured, her mind racing through possibilities. "Instead of fighting the adaptation, what if we tricked them into adapting in a way that destroys them?" Echo, who had been resting nearby, lifted his head with obvious interest. His translator was now working perfectly, his voice carrying a strength that had been absent just days before. "The Zelthac tried many approaches," he said thoughtfully, "but they always sought to destroy the network. They never considered turning it into a weapon against itself." Sarah nodded, her fingers flying across her tablet as she began sketching out a theoretical treatment protocol. "The parasites adapt by sharing successful resistance patterns. But what if we introduced a pattern that looked successful but was actually self-destructive? It would require modifying her nanobotic treatments in a way that had never been attempted before. Instead of directly attacking the parasites, she would create a false treatment signature that the organisms would interpret as something to resist. Their own adaptation mechanism would then spread a resistance that was actually a poison, transmitted through their communication network to every parasite and every host simultaneously. It's brilliant, Kim breathed. But if it doesn't work? If it doesn't work, we'll have made things worse for everyone, Sarah finished grimly. The parasites could adapt to become even more virulent. Echo's amber eyes studied Sarah's face with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see straight through to her soul. The Vithani have discussed this among ourselves, he said finally. We know the risks you are taking for us. We know you could treat us safely one by one over many months. But we also know that our people elsewhere in Zeltic space do not have months. The weight of that statement settled over the medical bay like a heavy blanket. Sarah had been so focused on saving the 48 Vithani aboard her ship that she'd temporarily forgotten the larger implications. If the Zelthak were conducting these experiments across their empire, there could be thousands of Vithani suffering in similar facilities. How many? She asked quietly. Echo's response came after a long pause, as if he were consulting with the other Vithani through their empathic network. We estimate 12,000 of our people remain in Zelthak research facilities. Perhaps more. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. 12,000 sentient beings, subjected to the same tortures that had nearly killed Echo and the others. Even if her current treatment worked perfectly, it would take years to locate and treat them all using conventional methods. The network approach could save them all at once, she said, more to herself than to anyone else. If we can create a treatment that propagates through the parasitic communication system, you could poison every parasite in Zelthak space simultaneously, Kim finished. But you'd also be risking the lives of everyone aboard this ship. Sarah looked around the medical bay at the Vithani, who were slowly recovering under her care. Most were still weak, but their amber eyes held a clarity and hope that hadn't been there when they'd first arrived. They trusted her absolutely, not just with their own lives, but with the lives of their entire species. There's another factor to consider, Echo said softly. The Zelthak will not allow us to live if they believe we can spread information about their research. They abandoned this facility because they believed we would all die. If we survive, they will return to finish what the parasite started. The tactical implications of that statement weren't lost on Sarah. The Mercy was a medical frigate, not a warship. If the Zelthak decided to eliminate the evidence of their war crimes, her ship and everyone aboard would be defenseless. Commander Torres chose that moment to enter the medical bay, his expression grim. Doc, we've got a problem. Long-range sensors are picking up a Zelthak battle squadron heading for our position. Estimated arrival time is 36 hours. Sarah felt her heart sink. 36 hours wasn't nearly enough time to evacuate all the Vithani to safety, especially not the ones who were still critical. And there was nowhere to run. The Zelthak ships were faster and better armed than anything in the human fleet. How many ships? She asked. 7 heavy cruisers and a dreadnought, Torres replied. They're not coming to negotiate. Echo struggled to his feet, moving to stand beside Sarah with obvious determination despite his lingering weakness. Dr. Chen, you must attempt the network treatment. Not just for us, but for all Vithani everywhere. If you can save our people across Zelthak space, our deaths here will have meaning. Nobody's dying on my watch, Sarah said firmly. Not if I can help it. She turned to Kim and Torres, her mind made up. We're going to do this. We're going to save every Vithani in Zelthak space, and we're going to do it in the next 30 hours. That's impossible, Kim protested. Even if the network treatment works, we'd need to test it, verify the results, make sure there aren't any unexpected side effects. The Vithani are willing to be the test subjects, Sarah said, looking at Echo for confirmation. They understand the risks better than anyone. Echo nodded solemnly. We would rather die attempting to save our people than live knowing we could have tried. Sarah felt a familiar surge of the stubbornness that had carried her through medical school, through her residency, and through every impossible case she'd ever faced. The Zelthak thought they could commit genocide with impunity. They thought they could abandon innocent beings to die in agony and face no consequences. They were about to learn why humanity had earned its reputation as the galaxy's most tenacious species. When humans decided to save someone, they didn't stop until the job was done, no matter how impossible it seemed. All right, Sarah said, rolling up her sleeves. Let's teach some parasites why they shouldn't mess with human medicine. The next 18 hours became a blur of frantic calculation and desperate innovation. Dr. Sarah Chen had effectively turned the medical bay of the Mercy into a biological warfare laboratory. But instead of creating weapons, she was creating salvation. "The nanobotic matrix is stable," Lieutenant Kim reported, her voice tight with exhaustion and nervous energy. "But I still don't understand how you're going to make the parasites think this is something they need to resist." Sarah continued fine-tuning the molecular structure on her tablet. Her bloodshot eyes focused on sequences that would have challenged a team of specialists under normal circumstances. "It's all about the signature," she explained. "The parasites recognize threats based on how they interact with their cellular structure. If I can make the nanobots appear to be attacking in a way that triggers their adaptation response, they'll automatically develop a resistance that's actually a self-destruct sequence." Echo watched from his position near the main treatment console, where he'd insisted on remaining despite Sarah's protests that he needed rest. His empathic connection with the other Vithani made him an invaluable monitor for their overall condition. But Sarah could see the strain it was putting on his still-recovering system. "The others are prepared," Echo said softly. "We understand that some of us may not survive the treatment. But we also understand that this is our only chance to save our people across the galaxy." The weight of that responsibility threatened to crush Sarah's concentration. She'd never attempted anything remotely like this before. Medical treatments were supposed to be tested extensively, verified through multiple trials approved by ethics committees. What she was about to do violated every protocol she'd ever learned. But sometimes, she reflected grimly, being human meant ignoring the protocols when lives were at stake. "Commander Torres wants an update," Kim said, checking her communications panel. "The Zelthak squadron has increased speed. New arrival estimate is 28 hours. Sarah nodded without looking up from her work. 28 hours was still theoretically enough time, but only if everything went perfectly. And in her experience, nothing ever went perfectly. "There's something else," Kim continued hesitantly. "The quantum entanglement communicator has been picking up distress signals. Weak ones but consistent with Vithani biosignatures." "From where?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Everywhere. Across at least 14 Zelthak-controlled systems. If the signals are accurate, there are Vithani research facilities throughout their empire." Echo's ears flattened against his skull, and Sarah could see the pain in his amber eyes. "More than we thought," he said quietly. "Many more." The scope of the Zelthak's crimes was staggering, but it also reinforced Sarah's determination. If her network treatment worked, she wouldn't just be saving 48 individuals aboard her ship. She'd be saving thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of innocent beings who were suffering in facilities just like the one where they'd found Echo. "The treatment is ready," Sarah announced, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "But I want everyone to understand exactly what we're about to do. Once I introduce these nanobots into the first patient, the process becomes irreversible. The parasites will begin adapting immediately, and their network will spread the adaptation to every connected organism in Zelthak space." "And if your calculations are wrong?" Kim asked. "Then we'll have created a super parasite that could potentially spread beyond Zelthak space," Sarah admitted. "It could become the most virulent biological weapon in galactic history." The medical bay fell silent except for the soft humming of life support systems. Sarah looked around at the Vithani, who were conscious enough to understand what was happening. Each of them met her gaze with quiet resolve, their alien features somehow conveying an acceptance that made her throat tight with emotion. "There is another consideration," Echo said finally. "The Zelthak will detect the widespread failure of their biological weapons almost immediately. They will know that someone has developed a counter-treatment. And they'll come looking for whoever did it," Sarah finished. "They'll want to eliminate the source before it can be used again." Torres chose that moment to enter the medical bay, his expression grim. "Doc, I hate to add to your problems, but we've been monitoring Zelthak military communications. They're not just sending one battle squadron. They've got ships converging on this position from 3 different directions." Sarah felt her heart sink. "How many ships total?" 26 capital ships and at least 40 escorts, Torres replied. "They're not taking any chances." The implications were clear. The Zelthak weren't just coming to clean up a failed experiment. They were bringing enough firepower to sterilize the entire system. Whatever they thought might have happened here, they considered it a threat worthy of overwhelming force. "They know," Echo said quietly. "Somehow they know we survived." Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. Had the Zelthak detected their rescue operation? Were they monitoring for signs of successful treatment? Or had they simply decided that the potential for survivors was too dangerous to leave unchecked? It doesn't matter, she said finally. We're out of time for second-guessing. Either we do this now or everyone dies anyway. She moved to the primary treatment console, where the nanobotic solution waited in its containment chamber. The molecular structure she'd created was elegant in its simplicity. Once introduced into a parasitic network, it would spread like a virus, carried by the very communication system the parasites used to share resistance patterns. I'm going to be the first test subject, Echo announced, moving toward the treatment chair. No, Sarah said firmly. If something goes wrong, I need you here to communicate with the others. Someone else, Doctor, Echo interrupted gently. I am the strongest of us right now. If anyone can survive a failed treatment, it would be me. And if anyone should bear the responsibility for this choice, it should be the one who convinced you to make it. Sarah wanted to argue, but she could see the determination in Echo's amber eyes. More than that, she could sense the agreement from the other Vithani through subtle changes in their posture and breathing. They had made their decision as a group, and Echo was simply their representative. All right, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I want full monitoring on all patients. The moment anything looks wrong, we abort and try a different approach. Echo settled into the treatment chair with a grace that reminded Sarah of the earth cats she'd grown up with. But there was nothing domestic about the intelligence in his eyes as he looked at her one final time. Dr. Chen, he said formally, on behalf of my people everywhere, thank you for refusing to abandon us. Sarah activated the treatment protocol, watching as the nanobots began their journey into Echo's bloodstream. Within minutes, her scanners showed them making contact with the parasitic organisms. And then, exactly as she'd calculated, the network began to respond. The parasites didn't recognize the nanobots as a direct threat. Instead, they interpreted them as a new environmental challenge that required adaptation. And because the nanobots had been designed to mimic the signature of their own communication molecules, the parasites began incorporating elements of their structure into their resistance patterns. It's working, Kim breathed, watching as the parasitic organisms began to destabilize on a molecular level. They're actually poisoning themselves. On her long-range scanners, Sarah could see the effect beginning to cascade outward through quantum entanglement fields that the parasites used for instantaneous communication. Across the galaxy, in research facilities she'd never seen and might never know about, parasitic organisms were receiving the same self-destruct sequence and implementing it without question. For the first time in days, Sarah allowed herself to smile. The Zelthak had created the perfect biological weapon, but they'd forgotten the most important rule of warfare. The same network that makes your weapon unstoppable can also make it perfectly vulnerable. To the right kind of attack, humanity was about to remind them why underestimating the stubbornness of a determined medic was always a fatal mistake. The treatment worked beyond Sarah's wildest expectations. Within 6 hours, every parasitic organism in Echo's system had been eliminated, not by the nanobots directly, but by the parasites' own adaptation mechanisms turning against them. The molecular self-destruct sequence spread through their network like wildfire, and Sarah's long-range sensors confirmed that the effect was propagating across Zelthak space at the speed of quantum entanglement. We're receiving signals from 14 different systems, Lieutenant Kim reported, her voice filled with amazement. Vithani biosignatures are stabilizing across the board. Doctor, I think you just cured an entire species. Echo sat up in the treatment chair, his amber eyes brighter than Sarah had ever seen them. But instead of relief, his expression carried an urgency that made her stomach clench with apprehension. The Zelthak will detect the weapon failures within hours, he said, his translator now working with perfect clarity. They will know that someone has found a way to turn their own biological network against them. Sarah nodded grimly. She'd been so focused on saving lives that she'd temporarily forgotten the tactical implications of what she'd accomplished. The parasitic weapons represented decades of Zelthak research and billions of credits in development costs. Their sudden, simultaneous failure across the entire empire would be impossible to hide or explain away. They'll know it was us, she said. The timing makes it obvious that the treatment originated from this ship. Commander Torres entered the medical bay, his expression carrying the weight of bad news. Doc, we've got confirmation. Zelthak High Command has declared a Class Alpha containment protocol for this entire system. They're bringing in everything they have. Sarah felt her blood run cold. A Class Alpha containment protocol meant the complete sterilization of a star system, including any inhabited planets. The Zelthak would rather commit genocide on a massive scale than risk Sarah's treatment spreading to other species. How long do we have? She asked. The main battle fleet will arrive in 18 hours, Torres replied. But they're sending advanced scouts ahead of the main force. We'll have company in about 6 hours. Echo's ears flattened against his skull as he processed the implications. They mean to kill everyone in this system to prevent your treatment from spreading. Billions of innocent lives. The weight of that responsibility threatened to crush Sarah's spirit. In saving the Vithani, had she doomed an entire star system? The inhabited worlds in this region were primarily agricultural colonies, home to peaceful species that had never threatened anyone. There has to be another way, she said desperately. We can't let them murder billions of people just to cover up their war crimes. Echo stood up from the treatment chair, his movements strong and confident for the first time since his rescue. There is a way, he said quietly, but it will require a sacrifice that humanity should not have to make. What are you talking about? Sarah asked. Echo turned to face the other Vithani in the medical bay, and Sarah could sense some kind of silent communication passing between them. When he turned back to her, his amber eyes held a resolve that reminded her why she'd found him begging for others' lives instead of his own. The Zelthak fear your treatment because they believe it could be adapted to work against their other biological weapons, Echo explained. If they believe that knowledge died with this ship, no, Sarah said firmly. We're not sacrificing anyone. There has to be another solution. Dr. Chen, Echo said gently, you have already saved thousands of my people across the galaxy. The Vithani owe you a debt that can never be repaid. Allow us to repay what we can. Before Sarah could respond, Lieutenant Kim called out from her sensor station. Doctor, you need to see this. I'm detecting massive power signatures from the direction of Zelthak space. Something big is happening. Sarah moved to the sensor display, her heart sinking as she processed the readings. Across multiple star systems, Zelthak research facilities were going into emergency lockdown, but more disturbing were the energy signatures that suggested they were implementing some kind of scorched earth protocol. They're destroying their own research stations, she breathed. They'd rather lose decades of work than risk the treatment spreading. Echo nodded grimly. The Zelthak have built their empire on biological supremacy. The possibility that other species could turn their weapons against them represents an existential threat to their power. A new signal appeared on Sarah's display, this one coming from much closer. Commander Torres cursed under his breath as he identified the source. Zelthak scout ships, he announced. 3 of them coming in fast. They'll be in weapons range in 20 minutes. Sarah's mind raced through options, but every scenario ended in disaster. The Mercy wasn't armed for combat against military vessels. Even if they could somehow escape this immediate threat, the main Zelthak fleet would hunt them across the galaxy. And even if they could hide indefinitely, the Zelthak would still sterilize this system to prevent any chance of the treatment spreading. There is another possibility, Echo said quietly. Something the Zelthak do not know about our people. What? Sarah asked. Our empathic network doesn't end with death, Echo explained. When Vithani die, especially in groups, our consciousness can sometimes merge with nearby quantum fields. The Zelthak never understood this because they see death as simply the end of usefulness. Sarah stared at him, not sure she understood the implications. You're talking about some kind of technological afterlife? I'm talking about the possibility of preserving not just our consciousness, but the complete memory of your treatment methodology, Echo said. If the Vithani aboard this ship were to die while linked to your ship's computer systems, we could embed that knowledge in quantum structures that the Zelthak cannot detect or destroy. The idea was both brilliant and horrifying. The Vithani were offering to die in order to preserve Sarah's treatment in a form that could eventually be recovered by other species, while making it appear to the Zelthak that all evidence of the cure had been destroyed. I won't ask you to die for this, Sarah said firmly. There has to be another way. Echo's response came not just from him, but from every conscious Vithani in the medical bay speaking in unison through their translators. Dr. Chen, you did not abandon us when we were dying. Do not abandon the galaxy now. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she realized what they were asking. The Vithani weren't just offering to sacrifice their lives. They were offering to sacrifice their chance at freedom, at returning to their homeworld, at rebuilding their civilization, all to ensure that other species would have the weapons needed to defend themselves against Zelthak biological warfare. The Zelthak scouts are powering weapons, Torres announced. 2 minutes to engagement range. Sarah looked around the medical bay at the beings she'd worked so desperately to save. Each of them met her gaze with quiet dignity, their amber eyes reflecting not fear but determination. They had made their choice and they were asking her to respect it. How would it work? She asked quietly. Echo moved to her computer console, his clawed hands surprisingly gentle as he began interfacing with the ship's systems. We would need to establish a direct neural link between our empathic network and your medical databases. When we die, our consciousness would carry that information into the quantum substrate that underlies space-time itself. And other species could eventually recover it. Any species with sufficient empathic sensitivity could access the quantum echoes we leave behind, Echo confirmed. It might take years or decades, but the knowledge would survive. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible decision. Save the Vithani she'd worked so hard to heal, and doom billions of innocents to Zelthak sterilization, or allow them to sacrifice themselves to preserve hope for the future. There's a third option, she said suddenly, her eyes snapping open as inspiration struck. What if we don't have to choose? Sarah's plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of choosing between saving the Vithani or preserving the treatment, she would do both by making the ultimate human gamble. She would bet everything on the power of truth. We're going to broadcast everything, she announced to the stunned silence of the medical bay. The entire treatment methodology, the proof that it works, and documentation of every Zelthak war crime we've uncovered. We're going to send it to every civilized species in the galaxy simultaneously. Commander Torres stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Doc, the Zelthak will still sterilize the system. Broadcasting the information won't save the people here. Yes, it will, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as her plan crystallized. Because once every species in the galaxy knows what the Zelthak have been doing, and more importantly knows how to defend against it, the Zelthak won't dare commit obvious genocide. It would unite every other species against them. Echo's amber eyes widened as he grasped the implications. You would make the treatment impossible to suppress by making it impossible to hide. Exactly, Sarah said, her fingers flying over her tablet as she began composing the transmission. The Zelthak's power depends on other species fearing their biological weapons. Once everyone knows those weapons can be turned against them, their entire strategic advantage disappears. Lieutenant Kim shook her head in amazement. It's crazy enough to work, but we'd need to get the transmission out before the scouts destroy us. Then we better work fast, Sarah replied, connecting her medical computers to the ship's communications array. Echo, I need you and the others to provide testimony about what the Zelthak did to your people. The galaxy needs to know the full scope of their crimes. What followed was the most frantic hour of Sarah's life. While the Zelthak scouts approached and Commander Torres performed increasingly desperate evasive maneuvers, Sarah and the Vithani collaborated to create the most damning indictment of systematic genocide in galactic history. The medical data alone was staggering. Documentation of parasitic weapons designed not just to kill, but to cause maximum suffering. Evidence of experiments conducted on children. Proof that the Zelthak had been testing biological weapons on enslaved populations for decades while presenting themselves to the galaxy as a civilized empire. But it was Echo's personal testimony that transformed the technical data into something that would shake the galactic community to its core. Speaking directly to the camera, his amber eyes clear and his voice steady, he described what it felt like to be forced to heal fellow prisoners, only to watch them be reinfected for the next round of experiments. He spoke of watching children die while their empathic screams echoed through the minds of every Vithani in the facility. The Zelthak see us as things, Echo said simply, not as people but as tools to be used and discarded. They did this to us because they could. They will do it to you if you let them. Sarah added her own analysis, explaining in terms that any medical professional would understand how the parasitic weapons worked and how her treatment could be adapted to counter them. She made sure to emphasize that the technique could be modified to work against other Zelthak biological weapons, effectively neutralizing their primary military advantage. Scouts are in weapons range, Torres announced. They're demanding our surrender. How much longer? Sarah asked, still uploading data to the transmission buffer. 30 seconds for basic transmission, 2 minutes for full documentation package, Kim replied. Take the 2 minutes, Sarah decided. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. The ship shuddered as the first Zelthak energy blasts struck their shields. The scouts were toying with them, Sarah realized. They wanted to capture the ship intact to examine what the humans had learned. Shields at 60%, Torres reported. They're using suppression weapons, trying to disable us without destroying the ship. Echo moved to stand beside Sarah, his large form radiating calm determination. Dr. Chen, whatever happens next, you should know that the Vithani consider you our liberator. Not just from the parasites, but from the despair that we would never see justice for our people. The ship shook again, more violently this time. Sarah could see on her displays that their shields were failing rapidly, under the concentrated fire of 3 military vessels. Transmission ready, Kim announced, broadcasting on all emergency frequencies in 15 seconds. Sarah held her breath as the countdown proceeded. Everything they'd worked for, everything the Vithani had suffered came down to whether they could get their message out before the Zelthak stopped them. Transmission sent, Kim called out triumphantly. Full documentation package is propagating through the quantum relay network. Every major world in the galaxy should receive it within 6 hours. The Zelthak scouts must have detected the transmission, because their suppression fire immediately shifted to full destructive mode. The ship's shields collapsed entirely and emergency alarms began blaring throughout the vessel. All hands prepare for evacuation, Torres announced over the intercom. This is not a drill. But Sarah wasn't ready to give up yet. As the ship's systems began failing around them, she activated one final protocol. Using the ship's emergency beacon, she broadcast a simple message on the frequency reserved for medical emergencies. This is Dr. Sarah Chen aboard the medical frigate Mercy. We have successfully treated victims of Zelthak biological weapons and shared our methodology with the galaxy. We are under attack by Zelthak forces attempting to silence us. Remember us and remember that every species has the right to defend itself against those who would treat sentient beings as expendable. The transmission cut off as another energy blast tore through the ship's communications array. But Sarah could see on her failing displays that the emergency beacon had been received by monitoring stations across 3 star systems. Echo placed one of his large paws on Sarah's shoulder, his touch somehow conveying both gratitude and peace. It is done, he said simply. The truth is free. As if in response to his words, Sarah's sensors detected a massive surge of quantum transmissions throughout local space. Her message was being retransmitted by automated emergency networks, bounced from station to station, copied and recopied by every civilization that received it. The Zelthak had spent decades building their empire on fear and secrecy. In the space of an hour, Sarah had shattered both foundations by doing the most human thing imaginable. She had refused to let injustice stand unchallenged, no matter the cost. The final Zelthak energy blast penetrated the ship's hull, and Sarah felt the artificial gravity begin to fail as life support systems collapsed. But as alarms wailed and emergency lights flickered, she found herself smiling. The Vithani throughout the galaxy were free. The Zelthak's biological weapons had been neutralized. And most importantly, every species in the galaxy now knew that the monsters who had seemed so invincible could be defeated by something as simple as a stubborn human medic who refused to abandon her patients. In her final moments, Sarah realized that she had accomplished something even more significant than saving lives. She had proven that sometimes the greatest act of healing wasn't curing a disease, but exposing the truth that allows others to cure themselves. The galaxy would remember what happened aboard the Mercy, and it would never again allow the strong to prey upon the weak with impunity. That, Sarah thought as darkness claimed her, was exactly the kind of legacy a human doctor should leave behind.